Every coin in his jar was earned through sweat and sacrifice, yet the moment he approached the bank counter, the air shifted. Unseen walls closed in, eyes weighed heavy with unspoken judgments, and a silence thick with suspicion swallowed him whole. This young black teenager became the invisible target of a system that thrives on erasing dignity without a word. But what seems like a story of quiet humiliation and relentless bias is only the surface of a secret that will shatter expectations and rewrite the rules of power. Brace yourself for a journey where the truth hides in plain sight, and the biggest revelation turns everything upside down. If you want to witness the full story unfold, like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. How far would you go when the world decides you don't belong? The doors of Highland Creek Savings Bank opened with a polite chime as Elric Claiborne stepped inside, clutching a round plastic jar nearly filled to the brim with coins. The container was cloudy from years of use, its lid worn and slightly warped, but it had held every single dollar Elric had saved that summer. He'd worked 7 days a week since school let out in June, cutting lawns under a merciless sun, hauling mulch bags twice his weight, scrubbing oil-stained garage floors for $5 tips, and babysitting 2 wild preschoolers whose parents couldn't afford daycare. Every coin was a moment of sweat, grime, and grit. His fingers had blisters. His back ached, but his heart was full of something like hope. This wasn't just about depositing money. It was about stepping into the adult world, doing something right, something real. He wanted a savings account in his name. A first step, something small but his. The air conditioning inside the bank struck his face and arms like a wave. It was much colder than expected, too crisp, almost sterile. Elric's eyes adjusted to the interior. Glass doors, polished tile, leather chairs lined neatly against the far wall, and counters that gleamed beneath 100 tiny LED bulbs. There were only a few customers. A man in a sports coat reviewing his phone, an elderly woman with curlers beneath a straw hat, and a mother juggling a toddler and a clipboard. A perfect time to be in and out. Elric smiled faintly to himself, adjusted his grip on the heavy container, and made his way toward the short line. He didn't see the glance right away. Behind the counter, a woman in her 40s wearing a blue blouse and stiff smile looked up from her monitor just as he entered. Her eyes scanned the coin jar first, then moved up to Elric's hands, his sweatshirt, the faded jeans, the 2 small shoes. Her face didn't move much, but her expression shifted, just enough for someone watching closely. She rose from her stool, walked to the small standing sign at her window, and quietly flipped it from open to appointment only. Then she turned without a word and resumed typing. Elric didn't notice. He was studying the posted instructions on how to open an account, checking if he had everything: student ID, social security card, the utility bill his mom had printed for proof of address. Everything was in order. The man in the sports coat glanced over his shoulder once when Elric stepped in line behind him, then did a double take when he saw the container of coins. He raised his eyebrows but said nothing. Elric didn't miss it, nor did he miss the shift in weight behind him. Someone moving. He looked up briefly and saw the security guard near the corner wall. At first, the man had been still, arms crossed, almost statuesque. Now, he peeled off from the wall. Not fast, not urgent, just deliberate. Step by step, the guard slowly moved toward the line, toward Elric. Not in any official way. No announcement. No reason. Just a quiet walk, hands clasped in front of him, eyes drifting casually, but always settling just a second too long on Elric. Elric's stomach tightened. He told himself it was nothing. Protocol, maybe. But he'd been in stores before and felt that same kind of stare. The not quite accusation, not quite warning look that followed boys like him through every aisle, just waiting for them to make the wrong move. Still, this was a bank. A real one. He took a steady breath and inched forward as the line moved. A minute later, the woman with the toddler was waved forward to another window, leaving just Elric and his coin jar next in line. That's when a second teller, young, maybe in her 20s, stepped out from behind the counter carrying a tray of deposit slips and pens. Elric's eyes lit up. He stepped forward to grab one, but the woman veered left and set the tray near the man behind him instead, completely bypassing him. The sports coat man gave a brief, confused glance, then shrugged and picked up a pen. Elric stood, hand half extended, then slowly lowered it. He looked around. Nothing seemed labeled. There were no spare pens nearby, no slips he could reach. He stepped back, heart beating slightly faster, palms sweaty against the plastic handle of his coin jar. Behind him, the security guard had stopped moving, but now stood directly across from him, perhaps 8 feet away, watching without watching. No expression, no shift in posture, just presence. A heavy one. The screen above the teller counters flashed numbers. The speaker announced, "Now serving number B04 at window 2. Elric wasn't holding a number. He wasn't sure he needed one. He stepped forward cautiously toward the only counter still open. Becky, her name tag said. She looked up barely. Her eyes moved to the coin jar first again, then to his face, then down. She didn't smile, didn't say a word, just lifted her chin slightly, as if to say, "Well." Elric stammered for a second, then leaned forward. He tried to explain he was here to open an account, that this was his savings, that he had everything he needed. Becky didn't interrupt, but she didn't respond either. Instead, she reached out her hand, palm up, waiting. Elric looked around again. Still no slips. He opened his backpack, fumbling for the envelope his mom had given him. The jar jostled slightly, and a soft clink echoed in the lobby. Heads turned. Someone in line behind him gave a small, irritated huff. Becky's lips pressed together. She said nothing, but her eyes said it all. Annoyance, disdain, delay. Elric's cheeks flushed. He retrieved the envelope, handed her the documents, and tried to smile. She glanced at them, gave a non-committal nod, and pointed to a small booth near the far wall. She said something under her breath. He didn't hear. She hadn't even explained what the next step was. She had simply gestured toward the corner booth, like one might direct someone to a waiting room they didn't want them in. That corner was far enough from the counters that Elric couldn't hear the conversations clearly, but close enough that he could feel the tension radiating across the tile. 10 minutes passed, then 15. No one approached. No one acknowledged him. Elric stood halfway up, unsure if he should return to the counter, when he saw Becky glance up, make brief eye contact, and then immediately turn her attention to the man in the sports coat who had just walked up behind the customer she had finished helping. Elric's mouth opened slightly, confused. He was clearly next. No number system, no appointment list, just a visible line, and he was in it before that man. But Becky smiled at the man, nodded as if they shared some private understanding, and motioned him forward. Her eyes passed over Elric without stopping, like he wasn't there at all. Elric stayed frozen for a few seconds, then slowly sat back down. His stomach tightened, not with hunger, but with a bitter tension he couldn't name. The coin jar felt heavier. His chest felt smaller. Every breath took effort, like the air around him was turning into something solid. Across the room, the same security guard remained planted near the middle of the lobby, not at the door like before. His head didn't move, but his body was angled directly toward Elric, the weight of his presence impossible to ignore. When another teller finally opened a window, Elric started to rise again, hopeful. But a younger staff member, wearing a wireless earpiece and holding a clipboard, appeared beside his booth and gestured toward the jar. Elric sat up straighter, trying to remain calm. He nodded politely and slid the jar toward her, assuming she was there to help weigh or count it. But she didn't take it to a machine. She didn't open it. She didn't even ask his name. She simply took the container, placed it inside a large transparent evidence-style bag, sealed it with a numbered red tag, and scribbled on a form attached to the top with a stapler that punched hard enough to echo. Then she affixed a bright yellow label across the front in block print. Suspicious, under review. Elric blinked. The woman didn't explain the label. She didn't make eye contact. She turned on her heel and carried the bag away toward the back of the teller line, disappearing through a door labeled Authorized Personnel Only. Elric remained seated, stunned. He wasn't sure if he should follow, ask questions, or stay where he was. He chose to wait, fists clenched in his lap, nails pressing against skin he didn't want to scratch in front of anyone. Across the lobby, the man in the sports coat was now being offered coffee. Becky smiled at him like he was a regular. She leaned on the counter. She laughed once, light and easy, in a way she hadn't with anyone else that morning. Elric's lips tightened. He shifted his gaze away and focused on the floor tiles, counting the gray lines between the white marble squares. The repetition helped, but not enough. His chest still felt like it had been stepped on. After another 10 minutes of waiting without updates, he stood slowly and walked toward the counter, hoping to catch the attention of someone, anyone. The younger teller looked up, not with concern, but with the disinterested expression of someone who's already decided you're not their responsibility. Elric tried to explain he had been waiting, that his coins were taken, that no one had told him what was happening. She offered only a shrug and pointed toward the same waiting booth. Her gesture was loose, almost lazy, like she didn't expect him to challenge it. He didn't. He returned to the booth, empty-handed now, even more unsure than before. The booth didn't feel like a waiting space anymore. It felt like a timeout corner, a warning zone, a place to put things or people that didn't belong out in the open. Elric sat with his back straight, eyes on the glass door that led to the teller's side, watching for any sign of someone coming back with his money. Instead, he saw Becky walk across the room with a rolling cart. On it were 3 zippered deposit bags filled with coins from the customers before him. Each bag had a neat label, a receipt tucked inside, and a green sticker that read "Cleared." They were placed in the regular vault bin under the counter. None of them had red tags. None of them had bright yellow stickers. And none of them were treated like evidence. The ache behind Elric's eyes deepened. He swallowed hard and looked down at his lap, ashamed to feel the heat pressing into his throat. He wasn't sure why he felt like crying, but he knew he couldn't. Not here, not now. He bit the inside of his cheek and breathed slowly through his nose. Just wait, he told himself. It would get sorted out. Eventually. It had to. That was how systems worked. The silence around him wasn't peaceful, it was surgical, the kind of quiet that made even the smallest movements feel loud. When the door finally opened, Elric sat up straight, his chest tightening with cautious relief. But it wasn't the woman who returned. Instead, a different employee stepped out, a man with a square jaw and buzz-cut hair who looked more like a corrections officer than a teller. He held Elric's coin jar inside the same evidence-style plastic bag, dangling it like it was a biohazard. Without acknowledging Elric, the man walked across the lobby toward a large gray machine near the far end of the counter area. Elric watched, confused and curious, his heart thudding with cautious optimism. Maybe this was part of the verification process. Maybe they had to count the coins before letting him proceed. That had to be it. The man approached the coin-counting machine, unlocked a safety latch on the side, and without warning, dumped the entire contents of Elric's jar into the tray. The machine roared to life, the noise jarring and mechanical, several decibels louder than anything else in the building. It was startling, abrasive, and immediate. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. The toddler in the waiting area began to cry. The man didn't flinch. He stood with arms folded as the machine clattered and groaned, spitting out coins and calculating totals. Elric felt every pair of eyes in the lobby shift toward him. There was no announcement, no explanation, but it was clear whose money was being counted. The noise made it obvious. The sound wasn't just disruptive, it was humiliating. The way the machine screamed and clanked made it feel like an alarm, like it had been set off specifically by him. The sound told a story louder than any words could. It said he was different. It said he was being processed, not served. The coin-counting machine had been used earlier that day, but never like this. Not so public, not so loud, not with this kind of deliberate placement. The previous customers with coins had been ushered to the side, their deposits handled discreetly, quietly, respectfully. Elric had been put on display. His savings, the product of weeks of labor, now felt like contraband. He sank slightly in his seat, his face burning, his hands clenched so tightly on his knees that his knuckles turned white. No one spoke to him. No one reassured him. No one explained why this was happening the way it was. A young woman behind the counter passed by the coin machine with a paper towel and a spray bottle in her hand. She glanced at Elric as she walked, then continued to the counter area he had visited earlier. Without hesitation, she sprayed the surface and began wiping it down with brisk, exaggerated strokes. She scrubbed the counter where Elric had briefly placed his documents, his hand, his jar. She didn't clean any other area, just that one. Her eyes didn't meet his. Her movements were methodical, robotic, yet unmistakably purposeful. Elric watched, unable to look away, unable to speak, the cleaning cloth moving back and forth like a silent message. "You don't belong here." A man in a plaid shirt near the front of a line chuckled under his breath. Elric heard it. Others likely did too, but no one said anything. The security guard, who had repositioned himself again near the center of the room, didn't intervene. He just watched, his expression unreadable but never kind. The coin-counting machine finally stopped with one last metallic rattle, the total displayed on a small monitor behind the teller desk. The buzz-cut man stared at it for a second, then scribbled something on a clipboard, collected the coins, and returned them to the plastic bag. He didn't call for Elric. He didn't even glance in his direction. He walked the bag back through the same door he came from and disappeared. Elric sat frozen. The sense of exposure was worse than before. He wasn't just being ignored now. He had been turned into a spectacle. The counting could have been done quietly. It could have been handled discreetly. But someone had chosen not to. Someone had chosen the machine, the volume, the location, and the lack of communication. It wasn't just about verifying coins. It was about reducing him to those coins, reducing him to noise. The kind of noise people wanted to end quickly. Elric looked down at the floor, blinking hard against the sting in his eyes. He refused to cry. Not here. Not while they watched him. Not while they wanted him to break. His jaw tightened. His body remained still, but inside, everything twisted. He had come here to start something good. He had expected it to be straightforward. He had expected some questions, maybe a little waiting. But not this. Not the stares. Not the silence. Not the theater of embarrassment crafted specifically around his presence. He felt small again, smaller than ever. No one else had been paraded like this. No one else had to endure this level of scrutiny. No one else had their money counted in front of the entire room with a machine, so loud it might as well have been a siren. And yet, somehow, all of this was happening without a single rule being broken. They weren't yelling. They weren't pushing. They weren't using slurs. But what they were doing was worse in some ways. They were making sure Elric knew exactly how far below everyone else he stood, without ever having to say it out loud. The bank's air felt colder now. Elric sat rigidly in the booth where he'd been told to wait, his hands folded so tightly his nails dug crescent marks into his palms. He didn't ask to be seen. He hadn't spoken a word in almost half an hour. But the silence around him wasn't neutral. It was weaponized. It pressed down on him, made his shoulders curl inward, made him smaller and smaller with each passing minute. Behind the counter, staff bustled with forced normalcy, helping other customers with smiles and quick efficiency, as though the boy seated in the corner didn't exist. Even Becky, who had changed a sign and skipped over him, now appeared friendly and patient with an older man who fumbled through multiple checks, taking up more time than Elric had spent in the entire building so far. No one seemed rushed. No one, except him, had been labeled suspicious. Elric's throat was dry, but he refused to ask for water. He refused to look weak. Every instinct told him that weakness would only be met with more distance. When the side door opened again, his gaze lifted instinctively, hoping to see someone carrying his coin jar, maybe a manager ready to explain the delay. Instead, a woman in a charcoal pantsuit entered. Older, more formal, clearly someone in authority. Her heels clacked sharply against the tile, her lips painted in a stiff maroon line, and her expression already carved in polished indifference. She carried a clipboard in one hand and a manila folder in the other. Without introducing herself, she walked directly toward Elric's booth, stopped just short of his table, and set the folder down in front of him like it was a legal summons. Then she pointed to it, expression unreadable, as if she expected him to know what it was. Elric opened it slowly and immediately furrowed his brows. The form inside wasn't a new account application. It wasn't even a standard deposit slip. It was a packet labeled Assistance Form, Emergency Funds Minor or At-Risk Individual. He blinked. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the first page. The form requested information for guardianship verification, shelter status, household food insecurity, and whether he'd been recently discharged from a foster care facility. Confused and humiliated, Elric looked up, holding the form gently as if touching it too firmly might stain him with its assumptions. "This isn't," he started, but the woman raised one hand slightly, not to acknowledge, but to silence, as if she were swatting away a buzzing noise. She didn't take back the form. She didn't explain. She simply turned and walked back toward the employee's side of the counter without waiting for a response, already scribbling on her clipboard like the matter had been settled. Elric sat there, heart pounding, heat crawling up the back of his neck. His documentation was in his backpack. He had presented it already. Valid student ID, recent utility bill in his mother's name, social security number, everything that had been asked of him. Nothing about his circumstances warranted this packet. But clearly, something about his presence had signaled to them that this was the category he belonged in, that the system had a drawer for boys like him, poor, black, and alone, and they didn't care how wrong it was as long as it was convenient. As he stared down at the at-risk minor label printed in bold across the top page, a shape moved in the corner of his eye. The security guard was approaching again, not rushing, just walking, hands behind his back, moving with that same deliberate slowness as before. When he reached the booth, he didn't speak. He simply pointed to a different chair, a molded plastic seat he had just carried over from the lobby entrance. It was older, scratched, the kind of temporary seat brought out during overflow or emergencies. Elric looked at the guard, then at the chair, then back again, trying to understand. The guard nodded toward the far back corner of the room, just to the side of the ATM area, where there were no windows, no seating, and no other customers. A spot not meant for waiting, but for being out of sight. It was clear now, he wasn't just being passed over, he was being removed, separated, displaced. This wasn't about capacity or policy. It was about optics. His very presence was seen as disruptive. Without speaking, Elric gathered his backpack and stood. His legs ached from sitting so long, and his pride ached even more. He walked across the lobby slowly, the plastic chair gripped awkwardly in one hand, trying to keep a step steady, his face expressionless, even as he felt eyes following him. No one stopped him. No one intervened. When he reached the corner, he placed the chair down and sat once more, now positioned beneath a blinking security camera and beside an outdated promotional poster for retirement plans. The marble floor beneath him was slightly colder here, the air vents blasting overhead with a mechanical hum that drowned out the rest of the lobby. The only sounds he could now hear clearly were the ATM beeping softly and the occasional snatches of distant laughter from staff at the front desk. He wasn't a customer anymore. He was a presence under observation. The air conditioner directly above him made his shoulders tense with cold, the hum from the vent blending with a low static of murmuring voices and clacking keyboards on the other side of the lobby. Even the occasional sound of the automated ATM beeping behind him did little to distract from the tight, invisible grip squeezing his chest. At this point, he wasn't expecting help. He was just hoping nothing got worse. He'd already been labeled suspicious, humiliated by the public counting of his savings, issued forms meant for homeless minors, and now exiled to the edge of the room where no one had to see him but everyone could watch. It was isolation by design. That realization settled deep into his bones like cold rain soaking through fabric. He was so still that the motion startled him when it finally happened. An older white man in a beige coat stepped into the lobby and walked past Elric on his way to the withdrawal slips. He appeared to be in his 70s, with a thin frame and slightly shaking hands, clutching a worn leather wallet and a cane as he moved. As he walked, the man unknowingly dropped the wallet, the soft slap of leather against tile breaking the monotony of sound around Elric. For a second, no one reacted. No staff noticed. No customer bent to assist. Without thinking, Elric stood and took 2 careful steps forward, picked up the wallet, and called out, "Sir." But his voice barely traveled before a sudden, sharp shout cracked the air. "Hey!" came the voice, aggressive and loud, like a starting gun. It wasn't the man who'd dropped the wallet. It was one of the bank employees, someone Elric hadn't interacted with before, a tall man in a collared shirt, eyes locked onto him like he had just witnessed a felony in progress. The staffer's voice echoed through the lobby, drawing everyone's attention in an instant. Elric froze, wallet in hand, stunned, chest thudding like it wanted to break free. The elderly man turned around slowly, confused, looking from Elric to the employee, then back again. "Put it down," the employee barked, stepping forward, his tone sharp, public, and laced with an accusation he didn't even try to hide. Elric's face burned. He held out the wallet toward the older man with both hands, palms open, arms slightly shaking. "He dropped it," he managed to say, voice small and strained. The man took the wallet back slowly, blinking in disbelief, offering a faint thank you. But the damage had already unraveled. The eyes in the room had shifted again, this time sharper, less curious, more certain. Elric felt them pierce his back like needles, stripping him down to his skin. The employee didn't apologize. He didn't correct himself. Instead, he glanced at the security guard, still standing in his usual position, and gave a silent nod. Elric turned and returned to his chair without a word, stomach twisting into knots, face hot with shame and helpless fury. He could feel the moisture building in his eyes again, but forced it back, pressing his tongue hard against the roof of his mouth, breathing through clenched teeth. He wanted to scream. He wanted to ask what he had done to deserve this. But he didn't, because deep down he already knew. He was black. He was alone, and he had touched something that wasn't his. In the eyes of everyone watching, that was all it took. The plastic chair creaked as he sat down again, a sound far too loud in a space where he already felt too large, too present, too visible. But the cruelest part came not from words or glares. It came from the ceiling. Mounted near the fluorescent light panels was a discreet black dome, one of the building's CCTV cameras. As Elric sat back down and tried to gather what little pride he had left, he noticed the lens inside the dome shift slightly. At first, he thought he imagined it. Then it moved again, angling ever so subtly, centering directly on him. His blood ran colder than the AC blowing on his shoulders. He turned his head slightly and waited. 10 seconds passed. The lens didn't move. 30 seconds. Still fixed on him. A full minute. Then, too, it wasn't coincidence. It was surveillance. He had seen these cameras in gas stations and grocery stores. He'd seen them used in schools when fights broke out. But here, now it wasn't about prevention. It was about control. He was being watched, not because of what he had done, but because of what they believed he might do. He sat there for 15 minutes without moving. 15 minutes of the camera lens remaining trained solely on him, its presence like a silent threat carved into plastic and steel. The staff continued helping customers. The buzz-cut man reappeared behind the counter. The woman who wiped down his space earlier passed by again with a tray of coffee for someone else. Life continued in the bank, but Elric's world had shrunk to a single spot in the corner, monitored and silent, where he wasn't a student, wasn't a kid with summer savings, wasn't even a customer. He was a target, a subject, a suspicion wearing human skin. The seat beneath him might as well have been a spotlight. Even when the room grew busier, even when new people entered, the camera never shifted. He checked it again at minute 5, still watching. He hadn't shifted in his seat, hadn't reached for his backpack, hadn't dared to scratch his head or adjust his hoodie for fear that the act might be interpreted as threatening, suspicious, or inappropriate. He had been transformed into an exhibit, a cautionary tale displayed for the comfort of everyone else in the room. The transactions around him continued, and though no one said his name, though no finger pointed out right, the message had already been sent and received. He was not one of them. He did not belong. He would not be trusted, no matter how still he sat or how quietly he breathed. Then came the voice, a small, high-pitched sound that momentarily sliced through the cold fog that had wrapped itself around his thoughts. "Are you in trouble?" Elric blinked. He hadn't even noticed the little girl approaching. She stood maybe 5 feet away, no older than 6, wearing a pink dress with unicorns on it and holding a half-eaten lollipop in her tiny hand. Her voice was innocent, curious, completely devoid of malice, as if she had simply asked someone the time or what day it was. Elric didn't respond right away. The question caught him off guard, not because of what was asked, but because of how plainly it reflected what everyone else had only dared to imply. He opened his mouth to answer, gently, with kindness, because he had younger cousins, and he knew how important it was not to scare children. But before he could speak, the girl's mother appeared behind her like a storm front. She grabbed her daughter's wrist with a suddenness that startled them both and yanked her back 2 full steps. The mother didn't look at Elric, not really. Her eyes passed over him like he was a dirty window she didn't want to touch. She didn't ask him what happened. She didn't check to see if her daughter had said something inappropriate. She didn't smile or apologize for the interruption. Instead, she looked directly at one of the tellers, then mouthed an apology to them. Not to Elric, to the staff. As if her daughter's mistake had been wandering too close to something dangerous, something defective, and now the mess needed cleaning. She pressed her hand firmly on the girl's shoulder and whispered something into her ear, then steered her away with a combination of urgency and practiced avoidance. The girl glanced over her shoulder once, confusion painted across her face. But her mother didn't let her linger. They disappeared into the line near the far wall, and the moment passed. Elric sat still again, but now the ache inside him felt deeper, heavier, like it was made of stone. The little girl's question clung to his ribs like ivy. Are you in trouble? Because that's what it looked like from the outside. That's what everyone in the room had been trained to see. Not a kid who had spent his summer mowing lawns. Not a boy who had waited patiently, followed every rule, brought every document. Not a customer. A problem. A caution sign. A caution sign that moments later became literal. A staff member approached. Not Becky, not the buzz-cut man, not the woman who had wiped down the counters. This one was different, young, maybe new, uncertain in her movements. She carried a small folding stand, the kind used to indicate wet floors or service interruptions. But this one was printed with different words, in bold black letters against a white background laminated in plastic. Do not assist without supervisor approval. Elric stared at it, unblinking, as she approached. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't offer explanation. She didn't say a single word. She just placed a stand on the floor 3 feet from his chair, turned, and walked away. That was it. No context, no comment, just policy in physical form. Elric looked at the sign, then around the room, waiting for anyone, to notice how absurd it was. But no one did. Or, if they did, they pretended not to. The sign stood like a boundary marker, a silent perimeter drawn around him that screamed what no one had yet said out loud. Stay away. Do not help. Do not speak. Do not engage. He stared at the letters until they blurred. He had never felt this hollow, never felt this erased. He had walked into this building hours ago, carrying a coin jar and a heart full of intention. He had wanted something simple, something small. A savings account. A first step toward the future. What he had been given instead was a lesson, written in stairs, in silence, in forms he didn't need, and now in a plastic sign that told everyone else he was not to be trusted. The irony stung. He had done everything right. He had waited. He had explained. He had picked up a wallet and returned it without hesitation. He couldn't look at it anymore, but he couldn't ignore it either. It radiated a message that echoed louder than any insult. This person is not safe. This person is not real. This person is less. The room had quieted further. Customers came and went, some glancing his way with pity, others with unease, and still others pretending he wasn't there at all. The staff made no further attempts to speak to him. His coins were still missing. No explanation had ever come. No paperwork returned. His summer's worth of labor remained hidden behind the locked doors of a system that had already judged him without a single word of acknowledgement. It was as though his existence had been reduced to a file, closed, stamped, and buried. The hours bled together. At some point, the bank's digital wall clock ticked past 4:30, and the announcement tone chimed softly overhead to remind customers the branch would close in 30 minutes. One by one, clients began finishing their business and drifting out the front doors, greeted with mechanical thank yous and automated wishes for a pleasant day. But none of that reached the cold pocket where Elric sat, far from courtesy, far from closure. Then, without warning, the door opened again, not with hesitation, but with authority. The chime rang out once more, but this time the sound had weight behind it. A woman stepped into the lobby, sharply dressed in a deep navy pantsuit and low heels that clicked purposefully against the marble floor. Her stride was steady, practiced, and confident, the kind that commanded attention without needing to raise her voice or wave her arms. The late afternoon sun framed her in warm gold from a glass door, but her demeanor was all steel. The second she entered, conversation stopped, not out of politeness, out of uncertainty. No one recognized her, yet her presence sent a ripple through the room. She wasn't a regular customer. She wasn't law enforcement, but she moved like someone used to being in control, someone who didn't wait in lines or take no for an answer. Every staff member behind the counter froze. Even Becky, who had spent the entire day avoiding eye contact with Elric, slowly straightened behind her screen, eyes narrowing, calculating. The security guard, stoic and silent for hours, shifted slightly at the center of the room, no longer bored, no longer still. The woman didn't glance at the tellers. She didn't pause to ask for assistance. She walked straight toward the back of the room, toward the unofficial detention zone, toward Elric. Her steps were deliberate, her eyes fixed on him with neither judgment nor fear, only purpose. Elric saw her coming and instinctively sat up straighter, unsure whether this was the next escalation or a complete reversal. She reached him in 6 seconds flat, stopping directly in front of him, towering just enough to assert her presence, but never leaning in. Her posture wasn't aggressive. It was controlled, calculated. Then she lowered herself slightly, just enough to speak at his level, and placed a hand gently but firmly on the back of his chair, not touching him, but anchoring the moment. "You okay?" she asked softly, her voice low, calm, and clipped with just enough urgency to matter. Elric opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His voice had been buried hours ago beneath silence and shame. She didn't push. She leaned in a fraction closer and whispered something into his ear, too quietly for anyone else to hear. His expression shifted instantly. His breath caught, his spine straightened, his eyes widening with recognition, confusion, and something else that hadn't appeared on his face all day: hope. Before anyone could process what was happening, the woman stood back up and reached into her blazer. From an interior pocket, she pulled out a slim black case, flipped it open with one hand, and revealed a security badge bearing a nameplate, agency seal, and ID number. The shine caught the overhead lights for a split second before she snapped it closed and turned to face the lobby. Her voice was no longer soft. "I need to speak with your branch manager immediately." The command, delivered with absolute certainty, sliced through the room like a siren. The buzz-cut teller stiffened. The younger woman who had dropped off the sign took a full step back. Becky turned pale. No one moved. The woman's eyes narrowed. "Now," she repeated. That one word changed everything. The manager, an older man in a burgundy tie who had remained out of sight most of the afternoon, suddenly emerged from a glass office at the far end of the building. He adjusted his name badge, trying to mask the unease bleeding into his expression, and approached with the wary smile of someone who didn't know whether he was about to receive a request or a subpoena. "Can I help you?" he asked, voice steady but rehearsed. The woman didn't smile. She didn't extend a hand. She pointed to the sign near Elric's feet and asked, "Who authorized that?" The manager hesitated. "We had some issues earlier. Standard protocol. A misunderstanding." "Stop," she said, her voice cutting clean through his excuse. "I've reviewed your protocols. That sign doesn't fall under any of them." Her tone wasn't raised, but the precision of her words struck harder than volume ever could. The manager blinked. The lobby had gone completely silent. No customer moved. No staff member interrupted. The woman's badge wasn't just metal and numbers. It was power, and she had just placed it squarely in the center of their illusion of authority. "We'll talk in your office," she added, her eyes flicking toward the door he had come from. The large flat-screen television mounted above the main teller counters, previously displaying cheerful advertisements for credit cards and personal loans, blinked briefly and switched channels without warning. The sudden change caught everyone's attention immediately. The screen went black for a second, then came alive with a crisp, professional video presentation, branded boldly with the logo of Springgate Financial Holdings, the parent company that owned the bank branch. A voiceover began, calm but authoritative, narrating as the screen showed images of high-rise office buildings, handshake deals, and employees working in bright, modern offices. Then the narrative took a serious tone. The video announced that Springgate Financial Holdings had undergone a strategic acquisition and restructuring, naming Vale Nora Claiborne as the new majority owner and chairwoman of the board. The camera zoomed in on a poised woman dressed in the same navy suit who had just entered the bank, the very woman who had whispered to Elric and demanded the manager's attention. Her image appeared alongside a title, Vale Nora Claiborne Chairwoman, Springgate Financial Holdings. Next, the video shifted focus to another name and face, a teenage boy standing confidently with his arms crossed, smiling faintly, wearing a clean white shirt. The title read, Elric Claiborne, Heir Apparent and Future Leader. The screen lingered on Elric's image for several seconds, accompanied by words describing his commitment to community empowerment, youth financial education, and systemic reform. Across the lobby, the staff froze. The buzzcut teller stopped mid-task, mouth slightly open. The younger woman who had placed the Do Not Assist sign let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Becky's eyes widened so much they nearly popped out of their sockets. The security guard straightened to full height, eyes flicking nervously between the screen and Elric. Customers, too, watched in stunned silence as the video continued with Vale Nora speaking passionately about her vision to transform Springgate Financial Holdings into a leader in equitable banking, one that served all communities regardless of background or appearance. The words were unmistakably clear. This branch, this very location, was at the heart of the change. The message on the screen was simple but revolutionary. The old system, the biases, the exclusions, were being torn down and rebuilt from the ground up, led by Vale Nora Claiborne and her son Elric, whose presence in the lobby contradicted everything the bank had pretended to believe about him all day. The weight of the revelation settled over the room like a thunderclap. Staff who had been complicit in Elric's mistreatment found themselves caught in a spotlight far brighter and less forgiving than the one they had shone on him. The silence was thick, palpable. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire bank had collectively held its breath, waiting for anyone, to break the spell. The branch manager, still standing near the office door, looked more vulnerable now, his confident veneer cracking under the pressure. He glanced nervously toward the video screen and then at the door where Vale Nora and Elric had disappeared. Something had changed. The rules had shifted. The power dynamic reversed. Elric, once the invisible target of suspicion and dismissal, was now the center of attention not because of who he had been, but because of who he was. The woman who had entered with authority returned to the lobby moments later, followed by the branch manager clutching a thick file folder and a tablet. She moved with purpose toward Elric's corner, the silence stretching as she knelt beside him. The tension in the lobby, thick and suffocating just moments ago, shifted palpably as the door to the back office quietly swung open once again. The buzz-cut teller, still standing frozen near the counter, glanced toward the entrance just as a woman emerged. She was middle-aged, with silver strands threading through dark hair pulled back tightly into a neat bun. Her eyes were sharp, steady, and carrying a weight that seemed to pull the entire room's attention without a word spoken. She wore a simple blouse and skirt, but her presence radiated authority, earned not by title or ceremony, but by years of silent leadership behind the scenes. The room seemed to lean in as she approached the front of the bank, her footsteps measured but unwavering, drawing near to the branch manager who still lingered beside the entrance to the office. Without hesitation, She reached up, unclipped the metal name badge pinned to her chest, and set it deliberately on the polished surface of the counter. The name was unmistakable to those who knew the bank's history. Victoria Langston, former Deputy Director of Operations and one of the highest-ranking officials to have worked at Springgate Financial Holdings for over 2 decades. Her gaze swept the room once, locking eyes with several staff members before settling on the manager, whose forced smile faltered into an awkward silence. The atmosphere grew heavier still. Staff who had spent the day participating in or silently condoning the mistreatment of Elric shifted uneasily. The younger teller shifted on her feet. The woman who had placed the "Do Not Assist" sign bit her lip, and even Becky's usual confidence wavered. Victoria's voice finally cut through the stillness, not loud, but carrying a clear steel edge. "This branch is now under formal review," she stated calmly, her eyes never leaving the manager's. Effective immediately, all staff involved in the handling of Mr. Claiborne's account and presence today are suspended pending a full investigation into compliance with company ethics and federal regulations. The words landed like a gavel strike. The bank manager swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the tablet he held, now a symbol of his diminishing control. "Effective immediately," Victoria repeated, emphasizing the seriousness of the action. Behind the teller counter, a system administrator, seated at a terminal, tapped a few keys and initiated a lockdown of internal records related to the branch's accounts and employee activities. Screens flickered with alerts, access restricted, audit mode enabled, compliance report pending. Staff exchanged nervous glances. The surveillance cameras, which had fixated relentlessly on Elric all day, now seemed less ominous, instead becoming silent witnesses to the unfolding reckoning. Victoria stepped closer to Elric's corner, kneeling again and speaking softly just for him. "You've shown incredible patience today. Things will change." Elric, who had barely believed anything good could come from this day, felt a fragile hope spark inside him. Around them, the bank's routine was collapsing. Calls were being made. Supervisors arrived. Security guards positioned themselves not to surveil customers, but to maintain order during the upheaval. The lobby that had been a theater of quiet discrimination transformed into a ground zero for accountability. As Victoria addressed the staff with a steady voice outlining new directives and compliance training, it became clear that this day was more than a disruption. It was a reckoning. No longer could systemic bias hide behind bureaucracy. No longer could the assumptions that had marginalized Elric remain unchallenged. Somewhere near the back of the room, a younger employee wiped tears from her eyes, a silent acknowledgement of shame and the painful path toward change. Outside, a few passers-by had stopped at the bank's windows, curious about the sudden flurry of activity, unaware that within these walls, history was quietly being rewritten. The sun poured through the tall windows of the former bank building, now transformed into a vibrant hub of learning and empowerment. The once sterile lobby, echoing with the footsteps of indifferent tellers and scrutinizing security guards, had been reimagined into a warm space filled with chatter, laughter, and the soft rustle of turning pages. Elric Claiborne, now a few months older and carrying the weight of his journey with quiet grace, stepped inside with a purposeful stride. Gone was the worn hoodie and scuffed sneakers of the boy who had entered that bank months ago. In their place was a tailored jacket and confident demeanor shaped by experience, resilience, and a vision that transcended personal pain. This was his center, a community finance and education nonprofit dedicated to empowering youth who had been marginalized, ignored, or dismissed by traditional systems. The walls were adorned with colorful murals depicting stories of struggle and triumph, of young faces from every background finding their voice and their future. Staff members greeted him warmly, many of them individuals who had once faced similar barriers, whose names might never have been on any corporate roster, but whose expertise and passion now fueled this new institution. The air buzzed with possibility, a stark contrast to the cold silence that had once defined the place. As Elric walked through the main hall, he paused to greet a group of teenagers clustered around a financial literacy workshop, their eyes bright with curiosity and hope. Their questions were sharp, their energy infectious. Nearby, a young woman helped a father fill out forms to open a first savings account for his daughter, patiently explaining terms with a kindness Elric himself had once been denied. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. This building stood as a monument to what could be rebuilt when the oppressed were given the keys to change rather than shackled by prejudice. Outside, the neighborhood had taken notice too. Word had spread about the center's mission, and local residents now stopped Elric on the street, offering nods of respect, words of gratitude, and sometimes just a simple thank you. They didn't praise him for wealth or inherited power. They honored him for choosing to build rather than break, for turning humiliation into action rather than revenge. The same corner of the city that had witnessed his humiliation now witnessed his leadership. The lessons he'd learned, painful, humiliating, and raw, had been forged into a blueprint for justice that welcomed all who had ever been told they didn't belong. Elric's mother stood beside him, her eyes moist but proud, watching as he led a tour of donors and partners through the center. Their shared history, the trials they'd endured, the battles fought in silence, was a quiet undercurrent beneath the conversations about grants and programming. For them, this was more than a building or a project. It was a reclamation, a restoration, a promise to every child who might one day walk through these doors. "We don't seek to punish," Elric told the group gathered in the lecture hall later that day. "Justice isn't about revenge or retribution. It's about changing the rules so that no one else has to suffer what we did. It's about building something stronger, more inclusive, and more compassionate." The applause that followed wasn't just polite, it was deeply earned. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light over the center's facade, Elric lingered by the entrance. He looked up at the old bank sign, now replaced by the center's name, painted proudly in bold letters: Springgate Community Finance and Education Center. The end. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more powerful, real-life, inspired narratives. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. What part of the plot resonated with you the most? Or what would you have done if you were in Elric's shoes? Share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear your perspective.